Hey everybody, this is Ian, and today you and I are going to be discussing Diane Ty's Baking as Biography, particularly Chapter 1 of Baking as Biography. This will be the first of 5 videos, one for each chapter, in this incredibly, I'm just going to say it, perfect book. Diane teaches at the folklore department at Memorial University. She was not simply a professor of mine, but a mentor, I will say, and just sort of an unheralded, lovely person. And I think her work focuses so much on the Atlantic Canada, and particularly Nova Scotia and a little bit of PEI in general, and now Newfoundland. And it focuses on women's the women's domestic sphere, and it is remarkably subversive in its own way, with this typical Atlantic Canadian facade of gentility. That might seem like I'm damning with faint praise, but as I always liked her stuff, and the more I read it, the more I like it. It is just quite wonderful. Today, so anyway, this is her book, Baking as Biography. It is a reflection on, literally and then figuratively, an inheritance. It's autoethnographic. It has to do with Diane and her mother's recipes in particular. Her mother died relatively young, and her I don't think she had hit 60 yet. And what was inherited by Diane on a tangible level was a collection of recipes, particularly her baking recipes. And the book starts off, and the chapter starts off, with this recollection. I'm going to be making white cookies, which are one of the earliest recipes in the collection, one that she got when she was living in Cape North, and I'll discuss that in a second. Meanwhile, of course, it is taxing my abilities, because I am meant to be creaming the shortening and the sugar, and I think I don't really know how to do that effectively, what tool to use. But these looks like it is going to be creamed soon enough, so I'm going to do this. So it starts off with this memory of Diane's in the kitchen, at home from a weekend at university. And she's sitting not in the kitchen, because the kitchen is too small. And she has that wonderful aside where she talks about how the small kitchens, not simply confined, and the expectation of domestic labor placed upon women, almost trapped them there as a form of solitary labor. There wouldn't have been room to help, even if help was offered or expected or demanded. The space just wouldn't allow it. So how these prejudices are built into the very geography of our houses. So within an hour, she's made the baking that is required of her for the week, to fill the larder, to fill the pantry with all the baked goods for her family. And she's just wrapping it up and putting everything away, and dusting her hands for flour. She sort of looks up at Diane and says, not in any kind of loaded way, not in any kind of foreboding way, but just like, I don't really like baking. And the idea that one of the elemental things, one of the things that defined her, the rhythm of her weeks, defined the expectations of who she was as a mother, as a wife, as a member of her community, in multiple different roles, was a thing that she didn't necessarily care to do. She didn't have a reputation for baking. This is Diane's mother, Laureen, if I haven't given her name yet. She didn't have a reputation for baking. She had a reputation for providing the way that she ought to provide, but it wasn't like everyone she wasn't accorded particular status for baking. She baked according to the expectations that were incumbent on her. She baked regularly. She didn't get much sense of accomplishment from it, save for the fact that she knew that she was doing the thing that was expected of her. And that one little memory sort of locates the entire book, because the question becomes, when reflecting back 20 years later, 20 years after this memory, which was when Laureen would have passed away, and then 20 years after Laureen passed away, which is when the book was published, that the legacy, the tangible remains of Laureen's life are basically in this cookbook, in this collection of recipes, not a cookbook, this recipe tin. And what does it mean when that fundamentally comprises someone's life work? Do you think this is creamed enough? I think if I start adding in other things, it would start to do it better. But there we go. I am going to crack an egg, and I have to beat it well. So that is the genesis of the book. Something as seemingly simple, seemingly humble, seemingly trivial, seemingly unimportant as her mother's collection of recipes. And what's more, something that is in some ways largely trivial for the family that she left behind, because again, she didn't have status as a baker. It was just something that she did and something that was expected of her. But she's no longer here. So that is the legacy that she is that they are contemplating and dealing with. So what does it mean when that is the accomplishment of a very intelligent, very kind, very loving, very wondrous person? One of the things we need to wrap our heads around is that when we are dealing with a life, and this is no disrespect to Laureen, and no disrespect to Diane, and no disrespect to anybody, but Laureen was in many ways unexceptional. But we are all unexceptional. And I mean, she was unexceptional as a baker, but her life was very typical of the life that so many women in Atlantic Canada of that generation, and so many women beyond that generation and outside of Atlantic Canada also live. And so through the study of looking at this person who is fundamentally not an exception when it comes to this particular realm, but a representative of a whole host of social roles that were and to a great extent still are incumbent upon women, some insight can be had. So it's just one person's life. Now, there are exceptions. One of the things that makes Laureen such an interesting topic for the book is that her life was, like all of ours, not typical. No one's life is typical. And the conditions of her life and her life story brings with it a certain amount of, this is what it's meant to look like, isn't it? There we go. The habits of her life, her practices, and the conditions, and both her choices and the things over which she didn't necessarily have any choice, were allowed for unique baking moments. And the interrelationship between her life and her recipes is fundamentally at the bottom of this book. So, Laureen was born and raised in Eureka, Nova Scotia. I've already done the sugar. I have to add hot milk, which is just outside of New Glasgow, so northern Nova Scotia, in an industrial area that had a mill for a little while. How long do I microwave milk for to make it hot? Man, I really don't know what I'm doing. I'm going to start with 20 seconds and hope that's okay. I'll speak into the microphone while I am waiting. So in an industrial area whose industrial days had more or less passed by the time that she was born. The community of Eureka, most of the people in that community at this point were most of the working men in that community were I'm going to give it another 20 seconds. Were basically commuting to Stellarton and other slightly larger communities in order to get there, in order to work. Otherwise, it was a fairly small town. She was of Scotch Presbyterian parents, or that Presbyterian background, but functioned in the United Church, and so of Scotch ancestry. So was and her food ways and her food habits and her basic outlook sort of was conditioned by that. Conditioned by it in terms of it being an aesthetic of simple, plain, hearty, sturdy. And we'll see that in the next chapter when we think about the food inheritances that Lorene had bringing into her family, what her mother taught her, what her mother's and father's orientations towards food were, and how they were the conditions in which the young married couple of Lorene and Henry entered in. Okay, 1 egg well beaten, soda dissolved in milk. Now in hot milk. I'm adding that, and I think I'm doing the right thing by doing so. Stir that in. She met Henry at United Church Camp, where he's a year her senior, and he was a sort of a camp counselor type thing. I mean, they were in their late teens. This wasn't a tawdry situation. And they more or less were dating the entire time that he was at university, where he went to, after his bachelor's degree, he went into the ministry, and he was a United Church minister. They got married, and they moved to Cape North, his first position, Cape North, Cape Breton. And at that time, it was clear that she was not quite prepared to provide for Henry. That's not what I wanted to say. Her role and the expectations of baking that was incumbent upon her, she was not prepared for. And again, we'll talk more about this in the next chapter. But her baking history was very small and very, and her new role, her childhood did not prepare her for her new role of minister's wife. And it's this role of minister's wife that is going to be one of the things that brings this book into such wonderful, sharp relief. I have to take 2 cups of flour, and I sift it together with a teaspoon of cream of tartar, which is a real thing that still exists in the 21st century. Boom, boom, boom. Some of that didn't get in there. That's fine. Teaspoon cream of tartar. Oh no, my teaspoon is too big to fit inside Mr. Jar. That's frustrating. There we go. So I'm going to stir the little bit that spilled over into it now. Now I will sift. So the expectations of the minister's wife was that not only would she be baking for her husband, as was expected and was incumbent upon women of that generation, but that she would have a public role. It would be her occupation for much of her life, an occupation for which she was not paid, but for which there was a certain skill setting. And so it was in Cape North where she started this development. And this recipe for white cookies is actually from Cape North itself, from Flora McCaskill, one of the earliest recipes in her collection. So Flora McCaskill gave her the white cookies recipe. Other people gave her recipes for oat cakes, something that Henry was not necessarily a big fan of, but other people were, and that was expected of her. So already we're discovering and again, more detail in videos/chapters to come, already we're discovering that her life as a baker was conditioned as much by the expectations of her placed upon her in her public role as much as in her private role. And she slowly started developing a competency in baking. They then moved to Parsborough, which is about an hour and a half west of Halifax. It's not too far from Spring Hill. It used to actually be the port where coal was shipped out of Spring Hill, which ceased about a year into their time there. They moved there when Diane herself was only about a couple of weeks old. But within a year, there was the Spring Hill mine disaster, and that ended it. That of course, ended the time. I am supposed to, according to the decorations, the ingredients, there is a may add nutmeg and vanilla. So I'm going to add some nutmeg. I don't know how much, so I'm just going to say that's probably good. And vanilla. Look, I bought some fancy vanilla. This stuff. Madagascar bourbon. So I'll just put a healthy glug of that in. I kind of want to lick the vanilla spoon, but the cameras are on me and you'll all judge me. There we go. So I'll mix that in. These are not going to be the whitest of the white cookies. I've added all this brown stuff, but we'll see. All right, we've now got something approaching cookie dough. Yes. So I'm going to move away from trying to stir it with a fork because I think this part is done. So they moved to Parsborough, and with Parsborough, it was still a small town, but it was a much more active church ladies community, just a slightly bit bigger. And being that much closer to, again, even though it was a small town, being sort of that much closer to the center of the province, there was the initial thrusts of trying to develop some kind of middle class identity, and the performance of cosmopolitanism that was important in Atlantic Canada in the post-war decades, conditioned in part by popular culture and the idea that the modern contemporary Canadian will have modern contemporary ingredients and eat modern contemporary foods using and preparing these modern contemporary foods for their modern contemporary husbands. Such was the idea. I'm going to roll this out. Do I flour? I wonder if there's a contingent of people at home who will be eventually watching this and going, no, don't. So with Parsborough, it was probably when she was most active in the church because it was a very active parish. Lots of church meetings, lots of societies and committees that she needed to be a part of by virtue of A, being a woman in that community, and doubly so being the minister's wife in that community. So as a result, the one thing I didn't get out before the video was the cookie cutter. How do I do this? How do I do this? How do I do this? I'm well outside of my comfort zone. Okay. Am I on too small a thing? I got this weird phobia. I'll just say it now because you're probably asking why I'm doing it this way. I kind of hate it when actual food is on my countertop. So I know probably it would be easier to roll it out on the countertop as opposed to this, and it would just drive me kind of crazy. So I'm not going to, and results may be disastrous because of it. Oh, I'm glad no one watches these videos. All right. Oh, boy. There's a thing that I want to investigate. And it's actually occasioned in part by some of the things that she talks about later in the chapter. Because the chapter, after giving a brief history of Laureen, who eventually went to their next parish was Charlottetown, which was that much more of a big city and that much more, it was a younger congregation. And so Lorene, for the first time, was really with people who were her own age and her own, really her own generation. So, where's the cookie cutter? I'm just going to stop talking. All right. This ain't pretty, but it's happening. So, you have this generation in Charlottetown of friends. It's not that she was completely alone in these other communities, but she was basically she had that distance of being the youngest person and the minister's wife. In Charlottetown, she had the beginning of a peer group that was not entirely occasioned by life in the church. It was also by being in the same neighborhood and having children the same age, and that kind of the way the peer groups are formed. So she began to identify as much through those peers as she did as the minister's wife. She still had minister's wife responsibilities, but they were a little bit fewer and further between, or they didn't exhaust everything. And she was, again, meeting with a different group of people who were younger, and they were slightly more urban and slightly more tuned in to the desire for metropolitanism. So, and her baking, her recipes started to reflect that as well. Later on, soon after, she moved to Amherst. The whole family moved to Amherst. The daughter, Diane's younger sister, Kathy, she was born hearing impaired. And Amherst was where there was a school for the Nova Scotia School for the Hearing Impaired. She could have gone as a boarder, but they didn't want to do that. Henry got a job in Sackville, New Brunswick, which is just across the border. And he basically became an administrator for the United Church, so he didn't have ministerial duties in the way that he did before. So, even less so was Lorene part of the minister's wife, participating in the minister's wife role. She was now much more mother. She had various jobs, including secretarial work. She had teaching assistant work at the school. She had other jobs. And she was less and less defined by the minister's wife role, to the point where not too long before she actually passed away in 1989, Henry had went back to Charlottetown to just have a few more years in the ministry. And she said, I'm not doing minister's wife thing again. I'm not going to have this unpaid labor. And that was actually sort of quite a revolutionary moment where she put her foot down. And again, this is no disrespect to Henry, who was not an adamant demagogue by any stretch. And so that's her life. Her life was occasioned very much by baking for a number of different audiences. Her husband and her children, the church ladies, and that sort of public display of femininity that the church meetings and all the committee work required of her. And finally, the friends and creating time with peers. And her, as I said, her recipes reflected that. Her recipes reflected ways of fulfilling those tasks judiciously and expeditiously and efficiently, and meeting the expectations and encumbrances and desires of the people that she would be baking for, while simultaneously reflecting input and contributions of recipes from those various communities. Again, like these white cookies from Cape North, to a very important cookbook, which we'll be talking about in chapter 2 or 3, from Parsborough to home magazines, ladies' magazines, Chatelaine, and that sort of thing, that were part of the domestic industry of creating the contemporary and updating the contemporary Canadian housewife, and those displays of cosmopolitanism that came as a consequence of that. I put a call out on Facebook for some advice. And this is one of the things that I just wanted as an aside before I go back to talking about Diane. There is a thing at the end where she talks about recipes as some people think that they are too small, too trivial, and too formulaic to really be considered as texts. And she points out later on, and she points to the various she points to the various this chapter is very much a literature review. So there's a couple of things where she's laying her argument down on the line so that she can do it now, so that she doesn't have to encumber the rest of the book with it. But one of the things that she considers is the way that recipes are she expresses it sort of like musical performances, and that there is a score, and then it's how, or some kind of received text, and then it's how that text is actually brought into being, which reminds me of the philosophy of art stuff, and really like some of the ontology of music, and with the distance between thin works and thick works. And a thick work is something like the score of like a symphonic score, where every instrument is told exactly what is to do. Every note is identified with a particular instrument. They do this, and so on. There's not much left to the individual discretion of the performers themselves. Of course, they can do it well or they can do it poorly, and it doesn't really exist outside of those moments of performance. But performance is indicated by the sort of exemplary execution of the composer's vision. And you imagine that it's going to be more or less the same from iteration to iteration. And it's going to be judged in part by how closely it resembles this very articulated set of expectations. And then there are some works that are basically, here's a melody, here's the key signature, here's the chords, go. And it's a very, very thin work, and it still has a structure to it, but it is open to much more to the interpretation. In fact, the expectation is that it's going to be interpreted time and again by various performers, and by an individual performer might do it differently time and time again, no less. So I was thinking about that with recipes, because sometimes they're very elaborate recipes and they need to be followed more or less exactly, not simply because of the science of food, but because this is the expectation and that this is what goes into this dish. And then there are some, and those are kind of thick works. And then there are some which are very thin works. And like this is an example of a thin work that doesn't even spell out things like temperature and time, because it knows that the individual is probably going to be fluent enough with the expectations of the genre in order to do it in an efficient way. So the idea of thinking of recipes as thick and thin works just intrigued me. So then Diane basically sets out to explain folklore to the audience that doesn't necessarily know what folklore is. The idea that it is of expressive acts, that it is of these smaller things, and that we are dealing more than anything with not thinking of these things as inviolate, but as thinking of these things as performances, that they are coded in many ways, and there are expectations that are there. We can look at them in terms of region. I need to set a timer. Someone said do it for 7 minutes and then turn it around. So there's the folkloristic approach, which she is clearly taking, that these are small expressive acts that do not draw attention to themselves, but are actually how we live in the day-to-day, that they are constitutive of and constitute communities, that through these small acts, through these things that are familiar and that fundamentally can go unreflected upon. That's not quite the word I'm looking for, but they are within their group considered basically accepted and normal and normative. They are the language of the group. We see, and they are, esoteric to the group. When we see someone else do them, do theirs, we might find them peculiar, but they are natural with us because they are part and parcel of who we are and what we are part of. We know this because you're all budding folklorists and understand this basic idea. And that Foodways works within that as well. And Foodways not being simply recipes or the specifics of foods and ingredients, but also the preparation not as a science but as a performance. And preparation is an understanding of audience. And that food is doubly so a matter of audience because it is both literally and figuratively a matter of appealing to tastes. And that the cook, the chef, whatever title that person might have, one of the things that they are doing when they are performing is they are having a sense of the expectations of their audience. What do they want to dazzle them? Do they want to meet expectations? Do they just want to do something that is almost perfunctory, that still will be considered acceptable, but is not necessarily meant to be seen as a marked performance? And so folklore allows for this, and we can understand it in terms of region. Atlantic Canada, and the food, the Laureen's recipes are conditioned by Atlantic Canada at this specific time, these post-war decades, which were critical. I mean, not that there's any decade that isn't critical. The death of certain industries, the resurgence of the emergence of new ones, the greater shift between rural and urban, and the idea of urbanism as an emerging value, which hadn't really been part of the Atlantic Canadian pastiche up until then. Certainly, the majority of the population was outside of the cities. By the time that Laureen passed away, the majority of the population had moved into urban settings. And connected with various forms of ethnic identity. Her Scotch Presbyterianism, influenced by the English, influenced by the Irish, influenced by the German, not particularly influenced by First Nations because of the legacy of colonialism, but influenced by trade and what was made available to Atlantic Canada. And religion. I mean, what constitutes proper food, what constitutes garish food, vulgar displays of food, what constitutes humility, all those things that are conditioned in part by how we operate within the group. There are also issues of socioeconomic class because there's so much of this that has to do with, first of all, local cuisines. Local food systems are often defined in part by, or conditioned in part by, what is available, and what is available not simply in the region, but in the actual household, in conditions of want, conditions of scarcity, conditions of not necessarily food deserts, that isn't the word that we are thinking of right now, but conditions of lack of access and lack of privilege. And so making do, feeding the family or feeding the community, feeding the group with whatever is available, and displaying creativity through that. And those foods often, when we push away, or we're no longer necessarily living in these moments of subsistence, and we have greater affluence and greater access to ingredients, those then might be recreated in sort of novel ways, and so they condition things. You think of things like the narrative of lobster in Atlantic Canada as a garbage fish, a food that one is embarrassed to eat. It is now celebrated in that way. So it was a food that would have been difficult to that challenged one's status, and then it became a food that now demonstrates one's status, but also demonstrates home. socios. But then it's not simply from scarcity. It's the matter of displaying. It's the matter of displaying middle class. It's a matter of displaying affluence. It's the matter of displaying cosmopolitanism. And so that is one of the things that can be done through food. If we think of food as signifying something or potentially signifying something. And this is a form of occupational folklore because it was her job. We can definitely speak in terms of the thinking of women's labor in the home as labor, as occupation, as having a specific skill set, as having status associated with doing it well, at the very least, as having harm or potential disruption done if it is not performed well, including the threat of violence. Again, not by Henry. Henry seems swell, but we know whereof we speak in terms of the greater patriarchal burden that is placed upon women. So how does one do this thing well? And then the occupation of minister's wife, this public performance. I'm going to turn the tray. I have been told to turn the tray in case my oven doesn't bake effectively. Oh my goodness, they expand. No one told me that they expand. Built into this being a form of occupational folklore, there is, and thinking of women's work as fundamentally an occupation, one of the things that is part of women's responsibility, again, through social conditioning, not inherently, is caring work, the demonstration of how one cares for one's family. And particularly food is vital to that, in that the domestic role of preparing food according to people's tastes and people's expectations is not simply in order to provide them sustenance. It goes above and beyond the mere functionality of that. The caring itself is part of the what food is meant to do, and that there is emotional labor that is part of women's work in general and as meant to be exemplified through food. So and again, it's culturally conditioned, but we know that we do this with food regularly, that food is a display of kindness, a display of warmth, a display of community, and doubly so within the family. And then it becomes incumbent upon the mother in many households to do that. And there's this wonderful, again, the book is peppered with these reflections, these are first-person accounts of Diane's, where she is talking about how she is almost would be ashamed were the students in her women's studies courses to see her baking for her boy, baking for her son Callum, because it almost to her seems antithetical to the sort of language of women's studies and the language of feminism as done in the late 90s and the early 2000s, as if it is somehow traitorous for someone to be doing this kind of work for one's family as a way of what? And she's like, but quite frankly, this is not simply how I want to do it. This is not something that is expected of me. This is something I want to do. This is something that I find value in doing. And you can't disentangle that, because she does clearly talk. And one of the key elements that she's considering is the feminist approach, where looking at, well, what are the conditions? Why was Lorene stuck in a kitchen doing this? And the power that is just omnipresent, and the skewing of power that is present in the idea of making someone do through whatever pressure something that they don't necessarily find pleasure in doing, that is expected of them, that is incumbent upon them. So again, it's not Henry, it's Atlantic Canada. Atlantic Canada does this. And again, it's not just Atlantic Canada, it's not just Canada, it is remarkably universal. But there is resistance there. First of all, there is the actual ability to find this work fulfilling, not necessarily the work that is being done, but this is how one does, this is how one cares. And don't like the baking, don't particularly take much enjoyment in the final product, aren't necessarily seeking status, and don't receive status from it. Nevertheless, doing something for one's family is inherently a positive good. And so there is that kind of resistance. Now, how can she meet those expectations in a way that also allows for a certain kind of subversion? And we'll get to that in chapter 4. And chapter 4 will blow your little minds. But the idea that it is not simply a passive acceptance of these roles. These roles are present, and we can lament the fact that these roles are present, but that does not mean that there is no agency. That does not mean that she is not able to work within that system to do something that is simultaneously fulfilling and for herself, that reconciles that tension of responsibility and liberty. And the responsibility might be thrown upon her, liberty might be something that's sometimes denied her, and yet she's able to be creative within it. I'm going to go check on the cookies because it's been a few minutes since I turned them. I do not want them to be too brown, and I don't think they are. So this is how they look. I'll turn that light on. Not too bad. They might be a little browner than they should be, but that's okay, I think. They, of course, they expanded, which no one told me about, and I'm going to blame all my friends. As I said, I put out a call out on Facebook to help me with this thick transcript. It's like, all right, so advice. How long? How long for? What temperature? Because the recipe doesn't say. There we go. I think that one will have cooled off enough for me to taste it at the end. And then finally, her process is autoethnography. And she is, much as she's talking about Laureen, she's talking about herself, because it is this matter of putting the subjectivity on display. I mean, no one could write about Laureen better than Diane. But still, her knowledge is imperfect. Her knowledge is imperfect in part, of course, because Laureen has passed away, and you can't ask Laureen's opinion, so it is a reconstruction. But it's a reconstruction that is built on one of the fundamental things about the study of food to begin with, and how much of it is related to memory. Because, as we said at the very beginning, this recipe box becomes a legacy, an inheritance. But it's not the box. It is, the recipes, there are messages in them, including, her life is reconstructed in names and places that are just in the corner of index cards, so you can read them that way. But really, it is just a box of paper, just a little bit of a record, until those recipes are brought into being. And then as she makes these things for, not sometimes for herself, and sometimes for her son, as a way of the sort of matrilinear genealogy of food, and as that form of caring work, and sometimes for the members of her family, her brother, her sister, her father. When it is done now, it is a form of remembrance, because it is a way of not simply through narrative, not simply through memory, but through that wonderful thing that food can do, that gustatorial moment, the idea that food is so very immersive, and why it's so present in ritual, that it can be redone. That can be redone. That's not what I'm trying to say. That it can almost literally transport her back to the kitchen of her youth with her mother there. And so as she is making, as she is going through these recipes, she can make them again. And you can get a taste of what it was like to be in her kitchen, in Laureen's kitchen 50 years in the past. Okay. They're probably still warm. This is what it turned into. Doesn't strike me as a white cookie, but it is fairly white. Oh, it crumbles like a cookie. That's pretty. It smells really good. Oh, well, that's quite the triumph. I'm sure there are better cookies to be had. I'm sure if I knew how much they were going to expand, I would have spread them out over 2 sheets or something, cooked them in 2 separate batches. I don't know, but none too shabby. So anyway, I will eventually be linking all these videos together. I might be able to come up with one of those clever things where you can click in the right-hand corner and lo and behold, go on to the next one. But I got to film the next one first, so cut me some slack. Until next time, my friends, we'll be looking at Feeding Our Family Well, which is Chapter 2. I wish you nothing but the best. Be well and eat well, and I will see you soon. Bye-bye.